In this video, we will talk about the Darwin's theory of evolution with reference to the evidences that Darwin presented in support of his theory of natural selection. So, first of all, what is a theory? A theory is a thoughtful explanation of observations of a natural world, and it has been constructed by using a scientific method, and it must be supported by evidences. So we are going to discuss the evidences of evolutionary change that were presented by Darwin to support his theory of evolution by means of natural selection. So first of all, we will talk about the fossil record. Fossils are basically the remains of organisms that existed in the past. So the fossil record indicates the evolutionary history of all the life forms that were present on the earth. Okay, so due to the fossils, we can trace the evolution of descendants from their ancestors. So according to fossil record, all of the organisms that exist today have been derived from the organisms that existed in the past. So transitional fossils play an important role in documenting the change in an organism over time. Transitional fossils are basically the fossils that exhibit the characteristics of both the ancestor and descendant lineages. So they exhibit both ancestral and derived characteristics. In this figure, you can see that this fossil exhibits the characteristics of both reptiles and birds. So this is the transitional fossil that acts as a tie between the reptilian and avian lineages. Next is biogeography. Biogeography shows that the distribution of organisms on Earth is explainable by assuming that organisms evolved in one locale. Okay, biogeography is basically the distribution of different living organisms on the earth in different regions of the earth. So from the biogeography, we can give a scientific explanation of the distribution of various life forms in different regions of the earth. So here in this figure, you can see the rhytite distribution in Gondwana land. Gondwana land is basically the about 200 million years ago, when Antarctica was joined by South America, Africa, India, and Australia in the form of a single large continent that was known as Gondwana land, or older Pangaea. It was also known as older Pangaea. All these continents were together in the form of a single continent, and then they started to drift apart. So the evolution of rhytites can be explained by this, you can see the rhytite distribution in modern day continents, and you can see that in one continent, for example in South America, there are ostriches. Next is rheas and emus. These are distributed in different continents. So with the passage of time, changes have, or modifications that have evolved in these populations, have been accumulated in these populations, and it has resulted in the evolution of different species of rhytites due to their geographical barriers that existed between these continents. So here is another example that Darwin noted that South America lacked rabbits. South America, there is no land connection of South America with other continents, so South America lacked rabbits, but the environment is suitable for these little creatures. But according to Darwin, rabbits evolved elsewhere, and there were no means of reaching South America because it had no land connection with other continents. So rabbits did not reach South America, and that's why South America lacked rabbits. So biogeography can be used as an explanation of how the organisms evolved and the distribution of organisms in different regions of the world. Next is vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are basically the non-functional remnants of structures that were functional in the past evolutionary history of that particular organism. So vestigial structures are basically the structures that are fully developed in one group of organism, and they're functional in that group, but in another group these are less developed and non-functional. Most of the bird species have well developed and functional wings, whereas some bird species, for example ostriches, rheas, emus, have reduced wings and they do not fly. So in these birds, the wings are the vestigial structures. They do not use the wings or the flight mechanisms. Next is the whales and snakes have no use of hind limbs. But in the extinct whales and snakes, they had the remnants of hip bones and legs. So these were the vestigial structures in the whales and snakes. Humans have tailbone, but they do not have tail. So these are the vestigial structures that indicate that all these have evolved from a common ancestor. Next is homologous structures. Homologous structures are the structures that have uh, maybe explained by inheritance from a common ancestor. They have evolved from a common ancestor. They have almost similar structure, but they perform different functions. So one example is the development during the developmental stages or ontogenetic development of vertebrates. All of the embryos, vertebrate embryos, possess a postnatral tail, and they have pharyngeal pouches, paired pharyngeal pouches that are supported by cartilaginous bars. But in case of fishes and amphibian larvae, these pharyngeal pouches develop into functioning gills, whereas in case of humans, the first pair of pouches develop into middle ear cavity and auditory tube. The second pair becomes the tonsils, and third and fourth pairs become thymus and parathyroid glands. So these structures next develop into the structures that are specific for that particular group of organisms. Next, in this figure, you can see the development, the forelimb of different vertebrate species. They have almost similar structure, but they have different functions. For example, the forelimbs of birds and bats have evolved to fly. They have been modified for flight, whereas in case of humans, humans and horses, in case of horses, these are modified for walking. Cats and whales, the flippers of whales are modified for swimming. So all these structures have evolved from a common ancestor, but now they have been modified to perform different functions. Next are the analogous structures. Analogous structures are basically the structures that perform the same functions, but they have different evolutionary origins. Okay, so homologous structures were those structures that have common evolutionary origin and they perform different functions, whereas analogous structures are the structures that have different evolutionary origin but they perform similar functions. Okay, so here you can see in this figure that the wings of birds and bats and the wings of insects, these are modified for flight. These are the structures that are used for flight, but they do not have similar evolutionary history. Okay, so the wings of birds and insects are analogous structures. Next is molecular evidence. Molecular evidence, it compares the biochemical molecules that include DNA, RNA, proteins. So these are the minor differences or mutations are observed between these structures, and due to these changes, the degree of change is used to indicate the degree of relatedness between different groups of organisms. All of the living organisms use similar biological molecules. For example, they use DNA as a hereditary material, ATP as a source of energy, and proteins. Proteins, all of the proteins are constructed by using only 20 amino acids in all organisms. So the sequence of DNA bases in different organisms can be compared and used as used to indicate the degree of relatedness between organisms. So by comparing the sequence of nucleotide in DNA, it has become evident that humans share a large number of genes with much simpler organisms. So molecular evidence can be used as a tool to indicate the degree of relatedness between different groups of organisms.